Joining us from Paris to talk about this is Chandra Bhushan. He's Deputy Director General of India's Centre for Science and Environment. Also with us from Paris is David Waskow. He's the Director of the International Climate Initiative at the World Resources Institute. Thanks to both of you for joining us. David, what do you make of the draft so far? Our understanding is that there is agreement on limiting warming to less than 2 degrees, but there are some gaps to be filled.
Well, the draft that was released last night was very encouraging. There were a number of good elements. Clearly, there's a lot of work to be done, and negotiators and ministers did work through the night on that. We were encouraged because the draft really points to an approach where we come out of Paris with momentum and build on that momentum, and countries would be coming back to the process to increase their action every 5 years, in part to increase their action on low carbon development and also building climate resilience, but also coming back regularly to increase finance and investment.
So you're saying this is the beginning of a long haul here. It's not the magic bullet that we're going to hear coming out of Paris immediately.
That's right. Paris is not really an end point. It's a turning point if it's done in the best way possible. And what countries need to do over the course of the next 24 to 48 hours is to really find the highest level of action they can to create an upward spiral. Clearly, it'll be important to find common ground and reach compromises. But in doing that, countries should really be aiming to find the ways in which they can get to the highest level of action possible.
Right. Chandra, India has been playing a leading role at these talks. And of course, India has come under pressure to commit to reducing its dependence on coal. India, of course, is a huge producer of coal. What do you make of the proposals on the table right now?
First of all, let me say that, I agree with David, it is a turning point, but the turning point is in shifting the burden of transition to the developing countries from developed countries. I believe that the draft text as it stands right now is not ambitious. It is not going to lead to an effective climate agreement. It will remain lowest common denominator simply because countries who should be taking the lead are not willing to take the lead. So I am very disappointed with the text. The so-called some certain bright points in this text is not good enough. In fact, US doesn't want finance and mitigation to be legally binding. The text on loss and damage is very, very poor. People are talking about less than 2 degrees, but the elements that are required to reach less than 2 degrees are not there. And therefore, the only thing we can say about Paris is that we are preparing to fight next year and next to next year and next to next year. So not at all happy with what is happening here right now. Also would like to say that coal issue is a non-issue. Frankly, it is not about coal, it is about fossil fuels, and you have to look at getting rid of fossil fuel collectively. India uses coal, US uses coal, China uses coal. Coal is still providing 30% of the global energy. It's not only about India. And then gas is taking up again, and we should be investing in other fossil fuels, which most of the developed countries are doing. They are reducing coal and investing in gas. So I don't think that there is a serious intent here in part of all countries. Let me say that. I'm not saying it is only about developed countries. But also, there is no serious intent here to actually look at the challenge ahead. We are looking at lowest common denominator at Paris.
Right. David, what do you make of those concerns being expressed there by Chandra? Is this agreement in some way being watered down to the point where it's not going to be very meaningful, just to get all countries on board?
Well, I don't think that we've seen the end of the story yet, and I think countries still have the opportunity to reach for a higher common ground, certainly, and the elements are there in the draft that we saw yesterday. If they are seized upon, I would say that I would add that we've come into Paris with quite a bit of momentum. We've had cities and businesses and 185 countries that have put forward national climate plans, and they actually increase action significantly. They don't get us over the finish line, though. So the question here is, how do we maintain and build on that momentum? And I would agree that it is important that we ensure that there's finance and investment going forward, and not only that we have strong signs coming out of here, but that we have a way for countries to return regularly to increase that investment so that we can have really the energy that's needed to fuel fuel global transition to a low-carbon economy. And also, I would add to climate resilience. We're seeing right now in India and Chennai the impacts of climate change, and vulnerability has been very much on the agenda here, and we absolutely need the resources and the attention to address that.
No, just to say that, it's quite glibly to talk about what is happening in Chennai, but when it comes to putting money on the table on loss and damage, I don't see anyone raising their hand, okay? And also all this thing about momentum of 185 countries INDC, you do an analysis and you find that it doesn't add up to even 3 degrees. We are looking at 3.5 degrees. So, it's one way to look at if the glass is half full. I think the glass is not even quarter full here.
Well, the question was, how big a challenge is it for a country like India to perform some kind, I guess, of a balancing act? On the one hand, to commit to limiting greenhouse gas emissions, on the other hand, to maintain economic growth?
I think that it's a co-benefit agenda for India. I always believe that a good development in India will mean lower local pollution as well as lower global pollution. India should be investing in energy efficiency, renewable energy, public transport, efficient industries, efficient housing. These are something that we should be doing. These are something that we are already doing or have plans of action to do it. But the fact is, even if we do all these things, there will be requirement of carbon emissions from India to meet basic development needs. I think that needs to be recognized, which means that India's emission will increase. Now, if you want to hold global temperature by less than 2 degrees, if India's emission has to increase, then someone will have to reduce and reduce significantly, okay? That is not happening, okay? The INDCs put on the table by developed countries are just not sufficient to allow the kind of carbon space India needs in the most low carbon trajectory to remain within 2 degrees. So I think that we need to understand the challenge on the table. The challenge on the table is that you have large number of countries who will require carbon space, okay? To give them carbon space, someone will have to vacate. That vacation is not happening.
David, how much progress have we made since the Kyoto Protocol in 1997? That required mostly rich countries to cut emissions. This climate accord, which is currently being discussed now, requires all countries to cut emissions.
Yeah, so there's no question that developed countries continue to need to take the lead, that's something that is still an imperative, that developed countries play that role. At the same time, I think we're beginning to see a shift so that this is not just a zero-sum game, but it is in fact an arena in which there are enormous opportunities from taking action on climate change. That shifting to low-carbon approaches such as renewable energy can in fact provide significant economic benefits. And for example, in rural areas, often renewable energy is the best and most efficient and cheapest energy source available. So there are reasons that I think many countries now want to move down a pathway of low carbon technologies and development. In India, for example, there's a goal of 100 gigawatts of solar energy by 2022. And that doesn't mean that that's the only source of energy India is going to be developing, but I think you see the way in which we can begin a global transformation with developed countries in the lead, but a global transformation to a low carbon economy. And also, I think, addressing these needs for climate resilience and adaptation that are very much relevant in many countries.
What about that, Chandra? Is there a win-win model here, for a country, a developing country that is, to have economic growth within a low-carbon economy?
Absolutely, absolutely fine. I mean to say win-win model exists, but it doesn't exist in all sectors. Okay, it is important to recognize this. Win-win exists in energy sector, but of the total greenhouse gas emissions that we are talking about, only about half is from energy sector. Okay. We have still not found a storage problem for renewable energy. We need to get that problem sorted out. So cost of solar is going down, but it is for 4 hours. How do we make it 24 hours? So there are technological challenges. We need to have technology agreement at Paris, which will make sure that there is a massive global investment in technologies, which don't exist right now. Okay, so win-win is fine, but you need to do much more beyond win-win. The fact is, the Paris Agreement, as it looks like right now, you will have little action for next 10 years. Your first stock taking will happen in 23, 24. okay? Which means that countries who have, and developed countries are not agreeing to do much on their pre-2020 targets. There was this discussion that the ambition gap in pre-2020 will be bridged by developed countries, that they are not willing to do. Everyone is going to have a stock take in 2023-24. It means for next 10 years, we are not looking at any significant enhancement of ambition by any country, okay? Which means that you are losing a decade of action which should start at Paris, but it's not happening.
David, one other thing, and that is the cost. Now, the United States has already pledged $861 million by 2020. Now, that's double its current commitment to aid countries that are bearing the brunt of climate change. And of course, the United States has already pledged an additional $3 billion, and that's for the development of green energy. How significant would this be in securing the support of developing nations to sweeten the deal for them?
Well, I wouldn't frame it as sweetening the deal so much as I would say that what we need are the kind of resources that enable countries to fulfill the ambitions that they have. That India wants to move to a significant amount of renewable energy, that it wants to build that as part of its approach to addressing energy access among its population, and that it wants to be able to tap resources, investments, and finance to do that. And so that's what needs to be part of the equation here.